Welcome back to our series on the Interactive Broker API. This is a continuation of our sub-series, which is part of our main series. In our sub-series, basically what we're doing is I'm just going to show you how to use the actual library, because I know there's an audience out there where you don't really care kind of the infrastructure behind or how it was built. You're just more concerned about, hey, how do I use the thing to do what I need it to do? So that's what this series is dedicated to. Before we do get started, though, I did want to take about a minute or two to kind of just give an update on some content that is coming to the channel. This was actually a highly requested topic. Sorry, I'm actually a lot better. I was sick the last couple of days, but I'm actually a lot better. But my voice can be a little bit raspy sometimes. So one of the most requested topics I think I've pretty much ever gotten on this channel, besides a trading robot, is Office add-ins. So obviously, if you've watched my channel, you know I have content that covers using the Office API and understanding kind of what that means going forward when it comes to automating Office applications. Well, what we can do with this API is we can also now build more dynamic add-ins that use different frameworks or web frameworks. And so I'm happy to say that we actually have a very simple add-in right now. There's still a little bit of more work to do, but I think for the most part, people will be very happy kind of where we're at, because this will basically walk you from start to finish how to build the thing, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to modify the ribbon, add buttons and groups to that ribbon, and then also adding the wonderful little icon that you eventually will want. How to build the task pane that will be used inside the add-in. Needs a second to load. And then we'll also talk about, user interface design, adding functionality to our task pane to do a wide range of things. The first series, it's going to be very simple. We're not doing anything remotely complicated per se. I want to keep it simple because if you've never done this, it's a lot, and there's a lot you have to kind of walk through. So just be ready. That's all I'm going to say. But right now, it's again, nothing fancy. It's just creating a table. And this isn't even going to be the functionality, but I just wanted to do it. And then I'm taking also the original one. But the big thing is that you want to take away from this series is start to finish, how do I build this thing? And more importantly, how do I distribute it? Because that's going to be a very big requirement, obviously, if you want to share it with people. But just an FYI, the first couple videos, we're not even going to be coding. It's literally just going to be understanding the framework, understanding the context, because there is a lot there. And if you're new to web development, it is confusing. I get confused when I look at this stuff because there's just so much, but I think it's in a good spot. All right, where are we at? Well, in the last video, we talked about cloning the repo. We talked about some of the installation requirements that are necessary in order to use this library. So one of them being Java. And then additionally, we kind of got things, I would say, set up in the sense of we extracted the client portal gateway, which is basically our mechanism in order to interact with the Interactive Brokers API. So we have to have that, and we have to start that up in order to actually use the API. So what we're going to do in this video is now we're going to go through the process of actually building some well, not building, but testing some functionality that already exists. Now, that's not to say the functionality is not going to change. It just means at this point, I'm okay with people using it and using it for different things, collecting data or whatever. Okay, so first things first, before we do get started, I can't remember if I covered it in this last video. I hope I didn't, but if I did, I'm going to cover it again. So something I use a lot in my videos are config files. I constantly get asked, what is a config file? Why do you use it? Well, that is a great question. A config file is literally just a Python file, but all I do inside of this config file is I just declare some variables. So as you can tell, right now I have 6 different variables. Most of it's just related to my account information. All I do is I just populate these variables with strings that contain the information that I want. They don't even have to be strings. They could be whatever they want. But the important thing is just understand their variables and just understand that they're stored in a Python file. And then all I do is inside my particular Python file, I just import that config file. Now you might be asking, why don't you just write the variables in the file that you're doing it with, right? Well, most time it contains sensitive information. And because I do record these videos, I don't obviously want some of that information out on YouTube for everyone to see. So what this allows me to do is still access that information, but it also makes sure that it's in a secure location that other people can't necessarily see. So sometimes you don't need to do a config file. If you're the only one who's using that particular file, you should be fine. In some cases, it makes a lot of sense to use a config file. So if during this process of using the library, you would like to have your own config file, there is a config.py file here for you to use. By all means, use it. Just make sure that everything you're passing through is a string. Once you've done that, you'll be good to go. All right, so how do we, I guess, get started with everything, right? Well, first things first is we do need to do what we would call a development mode install when it comes to using this particular library. So currently, if you were to download this, you might have import issues because it's not installed in the location where Python is going to look normally for a library. So what we have to do is we kind of have to mimic that behavior. The way we can do that is we can do a pip install, but what we're going to do is we're going to do a pip install that is in what we would call editable mode, but really that's just development mode. What that does is it installs it kind of, in a sense, in the local directory. So that way you can import it as you normally would inside your own file. So it's like you're installing kind of like a development mode of your particular library. Now, in order to do this, you do need one requirement, which is a setup.py file. Now, technically, when I do distribute this library onto the index manager for Python libraries, PyPy, I have to provide them with a setup file along with some other things related to, readmes and stuff like that. Now, for you, it's not going to really matter. At this point, all you need to know is how to run this particular Python file. Now, if during the video you forget, or if for whatever reason the video got ever taken down, there are some instructions inside the IBW library installation file. And so if you're in Visual Studio Code, there is a preview mode. So if you click right up here, I'm going to zoom this in actually just a tiny bit. There we go. If you open up this preview mode, it just basically takes the markdown file, makes it a little bit more pretty. Really, all you're concerned about is install the package in development mode. So down at step 3, all you want to do is copy this command. So just Control C. And you can just do Control J to open up the terminal. And then from here, you want to make sure that it activates everything that it needs to activate. And then just do Control V and then press Enter. So -E stands for editable mode, and then the period after that means just do the current directory that you're in, or the root directory, I guess, to be more specific. As you can tell, it looks like it installed everything and uninstalled the previous version, so it will uninstall previous version before installing the new one. So looks like everything went great. Then from here, if you actually go to it's basically called like an egg info file. It has all the information that happened during the installation. For the most part, it's blank right now, but normally if you are doing a lot of changes and stuff like that, you would actually see a bunch of information in here. So normally there's a lot, but right now there's not. Okay, then from here, we can actually now import our library in a very traditional fashion. So we can do from ibw.client import. And then what I want to do is I want to import the IB client. This represents the IB client object. This is basically our mechanism in order to interact and communicate with the API in a systematic manner. So the client, the IB client object, because it's a class object, lives in the IBW folder inside the client.py module. And you can see here, everything you need is right here. All fun and dandy. What did I change? I didn't change anything. Okay. And then I do need some login information. So I'm just going to do config Alex. Now, obviously, if you're using the traditional config file, it's not config Alex. It's just going to be config. And for the most part, just to make things easier on yourself, I would just recommend you put that config file in the IBW folder, just to, again, to make it consistent. And then from here, you want to import your information. Now, here comes the tricky part. You have to kind of define beforehand, what do you want to do when it comes to interacting with the API client? Do you want to interact using your paper account or your regular account? Most time, if it's something new and you're not confident it's going to work right, you better use your paper account. If you want to use your regular account, you can, but we just have to make sure that we're consistent with what we're importing and with what we're going to be entering into the actual authentication mechanism matches. If they don't match, it will not authenticate. So it's very important that you're consistent. I'm going to do my paper account. So I'm going to do paper account, paper password, and then paper username. Now, technically speaking, the only piece of information I need from you at a minimum is your paper account. Now, I do pass through the username and password. There was a point where I was going to automate some portion of the authentication process. There might be a possibility I still can, but right now I'm just leaving it in there. But technically speaking, you don't actually have to pass through, your password and username. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable. We're going to call it IB client. This will equal a new instance of our IB client object. And we're going to pass through some arguments. The first one is that username. So I'm going to do paper username. And then I'm going to do password. And then that's going to be my paper password, obviously. And then finally, I do need to pass through my account number, which will be my paper account. Oh. All right, so all I'm doing at this line, super simple, create a new instance of the clients. Now, we have a client does not mean we have a session. A client and a session are two different things. A client is the object we're going to use to create a session. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to do IB client, and I'm going to call the create session method. This is the functionality to create a new session. What's happening behind the scenes is it's going to start up that Java server, and then it's going to output some stuff to the terminal, and it's going to give you some directions on what to do next. So all I'm doing here is create a new session. Bam. Now, technically from here, you can actually get started. So there's nothing stopping you from running this script. You have, at a minimum, everything you need. So if I right click and do the, run Python file in terminal. Oh, I misspelled password. Well, that's not good. I'm just glad I can kind of talk. That's my only thing. Okay. So a couple things to note. You're going to see this terminal pop up. This is the Java server. Do not close this window unless you want to close the session. If you close this window, you've closed the session. It doesn't matter what goes on in the Python API. It's not going to authenticate at that point. It's not going to be able to send a request. So again, you close the terminal, you've closed the session. Most part, just minimize it, put it in the background, but don't close it. Then from here, you're going to see some instructions that are basically telling you what you need to do. So all it's letting you know is that the server is currently running and we need to authenticate you. So we basically need you to go and provide some information to the server. You're going to follow this URL that's provided right here. It will change in the future. This is the workaround because there is technically a bug right now when it comes to authentication. So if you're in Visual Studio Code, you're just going to hover over it until you see a line, and then you're going to do Control Click. You'll notice over here that a new window will pop up, and then you'll see that it takes you to a login page. This is where you need to provide your information in order to log into the session. Now, at this point, it's very important to remember, if you want to do paper trading, it is your paper username and your paper password. If you want to do regular trading, it is your regular username and your regular password. Sometimes they are the same, especially if you create a new account, I believe, with it or something. So I like to keep them separate. I'll create 2 separate passwords. I recommend you do the same. Now, from here, you just need to put it in like so. And then you're going to press login. Now, sometimes, not always, what will happen is you will log in. You will not see this page initially. You will not see client login succeeds. What you will instead see is the login information again. just add it again and then press enter again. Sometimes, not always, the server doesn't necessarily process the first request, especially if that last session wasn't closed correctly. So it just wants you to do it again. Additionally, if you are using your regular account, you will need to do two-factor authentication. There's no way around it. So that means if you have it set up on your phone where you're going to receive a text message, you'll receive a text message. You take the code from that text message and you're going to provide it in the input box. Or I've had some clients who they have it, enabled on their mobile app, then they can authenticate that way. But just keep in mind, if it's your regular account, you will need to do two-factor authentication. If it's your paper account, you don't need to. They don't care about your paper account, which is kind of nice. Okay, and then from here, we now know that the session has been successful, which is great. That's what we want. Now we can actually start making requests. Here's the big thing about requests. They're a little bit deceiving. Some requests have to be made after a second request. I will explain more when we get to that point, but just keep in mind, some requests have to be made after a certain request. Now, technically, we are still not done creating our session. So what we need to do is finish the process. What that means is I now need to tell the server, or at least Python, that yes, I would like to make an authenticated request because I have provided my credentials and I have arrived to a client login succeeds. Great. So at a minimum, we've created a new session and it's been authenticated. The neat thing about this too is the way I've built this library is this did not close. So this is now running in the background and it has created an authenticated session. What that means is you can run this script again and you will not have to go through that login process now, because what I'm doing is in the background, I basically I grab a process ID that's associated with this particular server. So what that means is I can look for that process ID on your operating system. And as long as I know it's still active, it means the server's still active. And if the server is still active, there's things I can do on my end to re-authenticate the session. Or in some cases, if you decide to exit it in a hard exit, I can actually close that process for you. So basically, I'm doing the cleanup work if you want to think about it. But at this point, to just kind of reiterate, you do not have to log in again. So you can actually run this again, and you'll see down here, it should just create a new session and not prompt you to log in. So that's kind of one of the neat things about this, is now you don't have to do it again. Okay, now comes the fun part, making requests. Now, I do, again, just kind of to reiterate, certain things are deceiving, to put it nicely. For example, account data. I'm just going to grab these just to kind of highlight something. One of these I will not be printing out, but the other one I will. So this one right here. I want to show you something. Let's just assume I run it as is. Oh no, we're not authenticated. What happened? Oh, well, it's a very specific code. Access denied. Here's the thing. Certain endpoints, you have to call other ones before them. In this case, if you want your account positions, you do need to call your account's endpoint beforehand. Now, what I am doing is I'm doing more testing on my end to see, A, if you only call it once, does that kind of fix the issue? Or is this, hey, every time you want to call that endpoint, you have to call it? Regardless of what the outcome is, I'm trying to fix this and I'm trying to improve this, where basically I'm calling it a safe call, which means even though you're calling this one, I'll call this one behind the scenes for you, basically. Now, what this means is if I uncomment this and then I run it again, let's see what happens this time. Okay, so you notice how on the second time we didn't have an issue? It was because we called the first one portfolio accounts first. For whatever reason, that's how they built the API. It's out of my control. I don't know why they're doing that. I'm assuming because, XYZ factors. But again, just to let everyone know, I'm trying to fix that process. I'd like to make it where you can make what I'll call safe calls in order to kind of get over this, because it's not really clear sometimes which ones you have to call first and which ones you don't. So it can be a little bit confusing. So don't be surprised if you're confused sometimes, like, why is it not working? Sometimes it literally could be you just didn't call a certain endpoint first. So I think this is also a good point to highlight that what does account positions give you? Obviously, it gives you all the positions on your account. What that means is you will see by your account each contract ID that you have with the average price, the realized P&L, and the unrealized P&L. Now, luckily, this is my paper account, but I'm not doing too well right now because I think I'm down a lot. I think I'm down 2,000 on that one. Which one is that? Oh, Spider. I think that's the Spider one. Oh. Yeah, but I'm down. Well, I'm pretty sure most people are down right now. I have Square, I think, too. But basically, if you want a list of all your positions, that's a really easy way to get it. In fact, what I'm going to do is just to kind of make it where you guys can see it a little bit better, I'm going to actually make it where we use the Pretty Print library. Pretty Print. Oh. Okay, let's run it again just so that way you can maybe see it a little bit cleaner. There we go. Perfect. So you can see, you get a lot of different stuff in here. You obviously get your account, you get your, the asset class, average cost, unrealized P&L, whatever it is. So a lot of good information here, but again, it's only related to the positions that you currently have in your portfolio. Now, this does actually lead me to my next point, which is from the API's perspective, it sees two different accounts. It sees what we call the server account and what we see as your portfolio account. The server account is the account that you currently created a session with using the API. So technically speaking, when I went into, into the authentication mode and I provided my credentials that related to my paper account, even though I provided that, I didn't technically set that as the server account. What happens behind the scene is when you pass through the account argument for when you initialize your IB client, that's what I use as your server account. So what that means is I create a session for the account that you pass through when you initialize the client. That's considered your server account. Beyond your server account, you have what we call a portfolio account. So your portfolio account could actually be a separate account that's not even associated with the server account. So it's very important to keep in mind those are two different accounts. Even though they might be under the same umbrella, from the API's perspective, they do see them as two separate accounts. Now, the interesting thing about that is, where is it? The server account has basically its own endpoints. One of those endpoints is what we call the P&L endpoint. So that basically just shares all the P&L information that's associated with that particular account. So if I run this again, I don't know, maybe this one I do have to call a different endpoint or not. I can't remember, to be honest. Okay, yeah. So I don't think it really gave me anything. I think it just gave me a P&L that's really nothing. But yeah, so the important thing to keep in mind is, again, certain endpoints are associated with different accounts, even though they might fall under your username, they are two different ones. Now, I also do want to illustrate something with the account positions one. Some individuals out there, they have a lot of positions, way more than I ever will. In those cases, we can actually iterate through what we call pages, and each page represents a certain number of positions that you want to see at a given time. Now, I don't have that many positions, so everything I have just shows up on the first page. But if you do have a ton of positions, you actually do have to iterate through those pages, or I think you can request multiple ones at once. Let me look really quickly. Yeah, I know there's 30 that you can do. So you can do 30 positions at once. Um, oh yeah, here's my note. Additional arguments need to be added. But I think I'm doing it too. I think there is something in the API where you can actually specify multiple pages at once. Let me just bring it up so that way I don't have to keep guessing. My brain, it's recovering. That's what I call it. Okay. So again, when you read through the documentation, you'll see right away account, portfolio. They're actually two different things. So even though they might have similar endpoints, they're actually different. Where is it? Portfolio positions, page ID. Yeah, and then there's other things that you can pass through too. Yeah. But basically, with this one, kind of the way when you're also like reading this documentation, because I do hope you read the documentation to a certain extent, really how you should be reading this is for this particular endpoint, there are certain arguments you have to provide. Now, these particular arguments do have to be provided in the actual URL path. The first argument is the account ID. It needs to be of string, and basically that's your description. It's an account ID. There's also another argument called page ID. This is also required, and it's also string. It does have a default value, which is 0, and that's also a string. Otherwise, it's a page ID. So if it's not 0, it needs to be 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so on. There are also some query parameters, which basically represent some additional items that you can pass through. These are considered arguments. They are not included in the path. These are parameters that you pass through when you make a GET request. Sorry, not a GET request. Yeah, a GET request. So these would be your arguments. There are 4 possible ones: model, sort, direction, and period. Each one of those is a string, and they also give you the description of what they do. So optional, declare the table to be sorted by which column. So for example, if I want to sort by contract ID, I would pass that through. In which order means ascending. A means ascending, D means descending. So how to sort it, ascending or descending. And then the period. Period for the P&L column. 1 day, 7 day, 1 month. And I think there's more because they're doing the ellipsis thing, but they don't specify which one. And then pretty much that's really how you should read the documentation. Additionally, they will tell you what type of request it is. So in this case, I can tell it's a post request, while this one down here, denoted in green, is a GET request. This is the full URL that you have to provide in, because if you don't do that, it won't like you. And then there's also some additional types of requests that you can make. There's delete, post, GET. I think there's a put, maybe a patch, maybe not. Oh, no, there's a put. But that's with notifications. Notifications are a whole different beast. As long as the video has been going. Okay. I'm going to close this one out just because I think we've covered enough. So at this point, if you have any questions about how to get the server started, how to create a session, just general information about the API, by all means, put them down in the comments below. In our next video, we're going to continue to explore some of the endpoints, but we're going to focus more on what I call the data endpoints. These are endpoints that return different types of information. Just an FYI, some of these endpoints will not be on the documentation, so just keep that in mind. Other than that, we will see you in the next video.